Horoscope 805 by E.S. Wynne. Part 1. Mr. Smith is an Aquarius. 5 days a week he takes the 805 as far as Mission Avenue and then walks half a block to the corporate office park where he works. Most nights he catches a cab home. Only twice has he walked or caught another bus. His home is an apartment on South Denton. 2 rooms, a closet-sized bathroom, and a bedroom window that looks out directly over the only entrance to a particularly seedy adult bookstore. Some nights he sits naked on his bed and watches the customers come and go, wondering how many of them are lonely, how many of them might actually talk to him. When it rains, a pot lined with shredded Teflon catches the water that drips from the roof of his bathroom. One night a woman notices his naked visage in the window just as she is about to enter the adult bookstore. She is beautiful in a haunting way. Her smile is radiant and rare as her platinum hair. She waves, and Mr. Smith waves back. He does not see the straight razor in her sleeve, does not know that she is on the run, that she has been told to come here. She gestures, he gestures back, and soon he finds himself directing her around to the staircase that leads up to his apartment. She smiles at his rising display of excitement, makes an erotic gesture that raises his hopes a little more, and then crosses the sidewalk to the door. Local law enforcement will find him in the morning after a neighbor with an irrational concern for him and the buddings of a stalker complex meekly decides to set aside her insecurities and break the ice with a gesture that shows she is a caring individual who might one day be exactly what Mr. Smith is looking for in a wife. Knocking weakly, she will discover the door has been left ajar, and calling out his name amid worried apologies for barging in, she will discover him splayed and butchered in the tossed and bloodied sheets of his bed, a cruel rictus where his stubbled throat had once been. Part 2. Mrs. Templeton is a Pisces. Twice a week she takes the 805 to the fitness center on the corner of 12th Street and Kearny and spends 2 to 3 hours watching the silken movements of women much younger than herself. Twice the owner, a Frenchman with a dubious accent, has offered her a chance to join them, but always she declines. The Frenchman is convinced that she cannot dance and believes that it is perhaps best that she never accepts his invitation. But in her dreams Mrs. Templeton sees herself as a young salmon, so swift and flexible that she steals his troop and leads them with footwork that is pure poetry. In her dreams the questionable Frenchman turns red with jealousy and sprouts a villain's black mustache, pursuing her with the flashing steel of an oversized santoku as she dances nimbly away. One day the mailman shoves a wad of envelopes through the slot, and one of these is marked with a South African address that Mrs. Templeton doesn't recognize. Innately curious and still musing about her latest dream with the Frenchman, she slips the blade of her chrome letter opener under the edge of the flap and slices the envelope open in one ragged sweep. Paper flexes in her hand, and as the envelope coughs a cloud of thick white powder, her hands begin to shake. One word throbs in her mind: anthrax. Making her way to the sink, she cringes with worry. Mrs. Templeton has been a hypochondriac for as long as she can remember, or at least since her husband's death 10 years before, to an antibiotic-resistant form of tuberculosis. She grips the soap in unsteady hands, scrubs until her skin is red and raw, but it is too late. Even now, she can feel the fever coming on, can feel the change in the world around her. Nervously, she checks her pulse, panics a little more as she realizes how fast her heart is beating, how hard it is to count beyond 5. Time blurs, minutes feel like hours, and soon she is lying on her couch, sucking in what she knows will be her final few gasping breaths. Only after a neighbor finds her desiccated corpse rotting slowly into the sofa will lab tests reveal that the powder leaking from the ruptured envelope is little more than baking soda laced with a highly concentrated psychotropic that takes effect the instant it dissolves into the mucous membranes of the nasal passages. The coroner, who performs her autopsy, will sigh and shake his head. No sign of viral infection. Cause of death? Massive cardiopulmonary infarction. Part 3. Miss Capistrano is an Aries. She rides the 8:05 on Mondays, Wednesdays, and catches a different bus on Thursday nights to get to a late-night business class that she loathes but knows she needs to take in order to graduate. Her skirts are always short, almost belt length, and even though her most seductive parts are obscured by a pristine white band of cotton and elastic that leaves both petals and curves entirely to the imagination, the skin that does show is enough to make most men glance or stumble when she bends over or sits. The thorns of her rose are the simple threat that a canister of pepper spray dangling off her belt like a talisman provides, and I know that I am not the only man who notices it. She is the kind of woman that both repels and attracts questionable men. Men like me. One night she misses the bus that normally carries her to her business class. The driver doesn't see her and, focusing entirely on a gap in the traffic, he darts out into the street, and the bus disappears into the throbbing depths of the city. Frustrated and abandoned, Miss Capistrano throws her hands into the air, then backs up and collapses onto a bench. Briefly, she considers skipping the class entirely, and absently chews a nail before she mentally slaps herself for both. Tonight is the review before the midterm, the last night before the exam that she knows will make or break her grade in the class. She has to go, and suddenly galvanized by her own resolve, she stands, shoulders her backpack, and starts off down the darkened streets toward her destiny. Near the quiet intersection of 2nd and Cedar, the pungent silhouette of an ape-like man will lurch into her path, block out the feeble yellow lights of the city, and fill her face with shadow. His eyes will shine in the light like sickly mirrors, and as he staggers a step toward her, she will back off reflexively. Her hand will go to the canister at her belt, but a hairy grip will meet her halfway, seize her wrist, before she can pull the weapon that is her only defense. In an instant, 2 monsters of greasy hair and beefy flesh will be on her, meaty hands filling her nose and mouth with the stink of sweat and machinery, of fish and crude. Moving like hunched demons, they will lurch sickly, impossibly fast as they drag her into the alley and press her into a mound of garbage that exhales rot and disease into her skin. A mouth will latch onto her face with all the virulence of a kiss of death, fill her lungs with hot contagion, darkness smothering the fragile rose of her soul, killing the essence within mere minutes before a more worldly scarlet will be set free from raggedly slashed veins. Long after she is dead, the numberless hordes of meaty ape-men will work themselves to climax in the vacant shell of her cooling flesh, and it won't be until a shivering and homeless invalid stumbles into the alley to search a nearby dumpster for a breakfast morsel that her discarded husk will be discovered, and an anonymous call placed to the police that will lead them to the grisly scene. Part 4. Mr. McGinnis is a Taurus. When he rides the 8:05, it is only to visit his sister at the south end of town. Usually he calls first, often 4 to 5 days in advance, and plans are made for a large family lunch that reminds him of the lunches his father used to take the family out to on Sundays, when both Mr. McGinnis and his sister were children. Now both Mr. McGinnis and his sister live alone, each nursing memories of broken attempts at forging their own families. Victim to a massive gastrointestinal infection, their father passed away 12 years ago. One day, Mr. McGinnis' alarm clock resets on a brownout as the sun crosses the line of the horizon into the cerulean sky. Blissfully unaware of its steady rise, Mr. McGinnis turns his back to the breaching dawn and sinks deeper into his pillow, snoring with all the fury and passion of an angry steer. It is well into noon when his snoring finally reaches a crescendo that wakes him, and shifting to drop back onto his meaty spine, he sucks in a wet, corpulent gasp and rubs at his nose. eyes bloodshot and going to yellow from decades of dietary abuse, slide jelly-like to the window, linger where harshly golden light and the specks of dust motes slash their way into the room. Thought comes slow, sluggish, and when realization of the lateness of the hour blossoms in his tired mind, he struggles to roll his prodigious bulk out of bed. Fat fingers grope for a pair of spectacles, and as he slips them on and stares squint-eyed at the broken clock, the red numbers flash 12 o'clock back at him. Grumbling, he makes his way to the kitchen, microwaves a sloppy cup of coffee tinged with the yellowish grains of a dry creamer, and squints at the never-ending stack of unfinished work piling up on his kitchen table. Looking at the pile makes him sleepy, and glancing at his kitchen clock, he realizes that his voicemail is probably full of irritated "where are you" messages, and decides the best course of action would be to simply scratch the day and go back to bed. When he returns to the bedroom, he absently closes the window he doesn't remember opening, and then rolls slowly back into bed, pressing the side of his porcine face into the soft pillow. His eyes wrinkle weakly at the edges, as he wonders briefly what the smell that rises up to greet him is. But it isn't enough to stir him or pique his curiosity. His eyes drift closed, and for the first time in the last 2 decades, Mr. McGinnis sleeps without snoring. Breath comes slower and shallower with each draw, and as his lungs fail, he gurgles a little on the edge of a shattered exhale, lips sputtering with thick saliva that dries and corrupted strings between his mouth and the pillow. When his death comes, it is quiet, painless, and without flair. Without realizing it, he passes on into darkness, and it is not until the eviction notice on his door, the mass of tickets on his car, his overflowing mailbox, and hundreds of unanswered voicemails attract the attention of a deputy, that anyone will find him. His death will be attributed to natural causes, and the rag tucked into his pillowcase will remain undiscovered until a child shakes the stiff cloth out onto the floor of an inner-city thrift store 5 years later. Part 5. Mrs. Anderson and Mrs. Jones are both Gemini. When they meet on the 805 and follow its route together until it arrives on a street corner 20 paces from Le Café Hôtelion, where tea and coffee come with unlimited refills, but the pastries are always overpriced and stale. Both women take great delight in the fact that they are married to lawyers who work at the same practice, and when people jokingly ask which of them is the evil twin, they force poker faces and point to each other until the resolve cracks and they break into laughter. One night, plans are made to ride together on a bus that will take them to the local theater for a subtitled screening of Non Avanilai, while their husbands are away at a Rotary Club meeting. By the time they arrive, the two women will be deep in conversation, grinning, laughing shrilly behind quick hands that cover excited mouths. Clutching glittering purses against elegant dresses, the stilettos of their high-heeled shoes tap quick rhythms against cold concrete, fill the unnoticed silence of the street with an irregular beat. A tall, gaunt-featured man bends at the waist to welcome them as they approach the theater, then hands them the pair of tickets so thoughtfully purchased by their husbands the day before. The dark door of the theater creaks ominously as they enter, conversation dying to quick whispers, little laughs that cover the emptiness of the musty darkness. Neither Mrs. Anderson or Mrs. Jones has thought to wear a watch, and neither woman checks her cell phone before thoughtfully switching it off. The tiny theater is empty, the slowly drifting screen still dark, but neither of them will notice or take it as out of the ordinary. Only after a long, stretching silence does conversation begin to wander, eyes crinkling a little at the edges with unease, uncertainty. Mrs. Anderson glances back toward the projection booth just in time to see it flare up with the lights of images that shock Mrs. Jones, take the air from her lungs, silence her utterly. A familiar, seductive chuckle tinkles through the air, carries with it a breeze of seedy whispers that makes Mrs. Anderson's hair stand on end. Even before she can turn her eyes back to the screen, she knows what she will see. She knows all the sounds, the moans, the desperate cries of this film. Mrs. Jones' eyes stab at Mrs. Anderson as her husband's voice judders through a wild climax, fills the dark theater with a damning, "You're so much better than my wife." When the authorities kick in the theater door the next morning, they will find only a blank screen, the reel of film long since broken, spinning endlessly. A young officer will discover the two women a few minutes later, the beam of his flashlight drifting across ragged wounds, the words, "Cheating bitch," carved into skin, wrists opened, throats left torn, long since drained of blood. Part 6. Mr. Hiramoshi is a Cancer. He avoids the 805 whenever possible, but meetings at the factory often force him to take the bus on sporadic days that follow no real pattern. He is a quiet man, stiff and upright, as emotionless on the outside as a smooth stone wall, as sterile as the Spartan, IKEA-inspired, closet-sized apartment he maintains on the 5th story of a complex on South Victor. Twice a month, his mother calls him from her home in Nagasaki. At the end of every call, she asks him if he's found a woman to share his life with yet, but his reply is always a quiet, "No." The disapproval in her silence is tangible, lingers when she asks him why, remarks in the few breaths before her final goodbyes, "Whores are as thick as rats in the city. Surely there is at least one that would make a good wife." The shiver that breaks loose at her words is the one emotional expression Mr. Hiramoshi cannot contain. One day, Mr. Hiramoshi meets a woman with black nails and a matching pleated skirt while picking up a pint of skim milk from the corner store. She grins a little at him, eyes lingering on his crotch as she chews a wad of gum, tongue absently teasing the hidden end of one of the studs poking from beneath her generous, seductive lips. Swallowing, nervous at first, Mr. Hiramoshi will look away, remember his mother's words, then force himself to look back, meet her eyes. 10 minutes later, she will be ripping the buttons off his shirt, pinning him to the minimalist sheets of his single bed with hungry, powerful thighs. A rush of excitement will break through Mr. Hiramoshi's placid exterior, and as the woman drags her tongue in a slow, descending line to his bulging briefs, he will choke, begin to cry. The weekend will pass in silence, the first 2 work-days of the week broken only by a pair of noontime phone calls placed by the gum-popping secretary at the factory. Authorities won't find Mr. Hiramoshi's body until several weeks later when, on a routine search for transients in an abandoned warehouse at the south end of the city, a stocky officer will grab his filthy tennis shoes and yank the rat-chewed and snake-bitten corpse out of a muddy pile of cardboard and into the yellow dawn light. Part 7. Miss Scarlatti Epson is a Leo. She hails the 805 from the corner of Adams and Bradshaw on random Wednesdays, and despite the fact that there is no official stop there, the driver makes an exception for her. He knows that she is an actress, that her smile is as ready and sweet as the fruit between her thighs, but he also knows his place. In her eyes, he is little more than an inner-city bus driver, a Gentile, the kind of lesser man that is forbidden from tasting this delicacy that only the directors, producers, and casting agents of the city have easy access to. In her eyes, he is nothing more than an unseen distraction to be ignored with a cheerful greeting and an ivory smile. One night, after spending a drowsy day perusing dog-eared scripts in which her agent hopes to have her cast as something more than her usual minor or bit roles, Miss Scarlatti Epson sets aside her teacup and rubs at the wrinkles she swears she can already feel taking root at the edges of her eyes. Light from a passing car glows in the river waves of rain rolling against her window, and as she looks up to regard the damp darkness beyond, she briefly considers staying in, cuddling with her purple body pillow in a tangle of satin sheets. Tired, she runs a hand over the soft cotton paper of an invitation, taps the date and time, 2 hours, 2 hours until the party. 2 hours until she will step through the door, smooth the lines the taxi has left in her finest dress, trade fake smiles with the watchers, and those who wish to be watched as quick as they come. Rumors will circulate like absinthe, tantalizing tongues, minds drawing eyes. Tonight, decisions will be made. Tonight, tomorrow's stars will shine. Shine as hard and wildly as reality does by the time Miss Scarlatti Epson reaches her third drink. Life will become a moment of laughter caught in shining amber, and then her glass will be empty again. Refilled. Empty. Refilled. Darkness will set in. Envelope the blur, lead her to a couch that looks far too comfortable to be denied. When she awakens, she will awake unable to move, unable to do anything but tense and swell against solid clothes, paralyzing walls. In a moment of half-lucid panic, Miss Scarlatti Epson will realize that she has been buried alive, sealed somewhere close to the sounds of the streets in the city. Panic will grow as she begins to shake, skin prickling, vibrating in terror. But the seal is tight, and only as she begins to starve to death will her concrete cocoon allow her the precious few inches of space she needs to scream. The sound will come muffled and distant, unrecognizable through the two tiny straws that bend toward the surface of the sidewalk, mere inches above. And when the first rain comes, and cruel droplets of icy water thread their way through the narrow breathing holes and into the depths of her cracked and dry sinuses, the choking attempts to inhale past the wetness will drive her to a fresher panic. It will take a torturous 10 hours for her lungs to fill with the frigid rain, and even then her eyes will search the darkness for meaning, stretched distended in death. Part 8. Mr. Schwarzenherz is a Virgo. On Tuesdays and Thursdays he takes the 805 into the inner city, where he shares coffee and dark chocolate with his illicit mistress before walking the final 3 blocks to the school where he teaches theology. Twice a week he torments his students for 7 hours, with 15-minute breaks between each session, and he prides himself on the fact that he emerges from the doors of the school exactly 7 hours, 7 minutes, and 7 seconds after he enters. But my watch is very precise, and there are days when he leaves early, and there are days when he stays for only 6 hours, 6 minutes, and 6 seconds. His birthday is one of these days. One day, Mr. Schwarzenherz arrives at the apartment where his mistress lives to find a large, unfamiliar dog standing just inside. For a moment, the temptation to turn around and leave will pass through his mind, tease his senses, but the lure of curiosity will be too great, and like a child he will reach for the dog, smile and whisper. The dog will stop panting, hesitate, then growl in a sudden seriousness. And as Mr. Schwarzenherz stands fully upright, his body tightening into the rigid lines of adrenal fear, a shadowy shape will bring the length of a baseball bat down upon the back of his greasy blonde head and silence his cruel mind forever. 3 days later, authorities will find Mrs. Schwarzenherz at her home and in bed with a gun in her mouth, the back of her own skull missing, her husband and the corpse of the strange dog heaped into a rotting pile at her feet. The body of the mistress, ground up and delivered to a local meat processing facility in unmarked boxes over a period of 5 days, will never be officially found. Part 9. Mr. Angeletti is a Libra. Every day his 15-year-old son rides the 805 to the smoke shop on the corner of Washington and Broadway, where he works instead of going to school. Regularly, Mr. Angeletti rides beside him with the intention of gambling away another fraction of his savings in the dimly lit poker rooms sealed from the public by the cunning placement of a sign that says, "Employees Only." Occasionally, Mr. Angeletti runs short on cash, tries to borrow from his son, gives his son fresh bruises and cigarette burns when the inevitable attempts at refusal come. One night, Mr. Angeletti punches his son when the boy tries to drag him away from a winning streak in the interest of catching the last bus back home. Screaming, cursing, he kicks the boy, drives him away, and laughs as his only son staggers out of the poker room, tears of hatred rolling down his twisted young face. The other players watch in impassive silence, turn their eyes back to their cards as Mr. Angeletti sits down again, lights a fresh cigarette, and grins his way through a hand he is wholly certain he will win. When his luck turns sour again, and the man across the table from him cleans him out, liquidating everything he'd won during the game, Mr. Angeletti throws his cards against the table, stomps off into the darkness without a word. The cold touch of night sinks into him so quickly that he shivers, lights another cigarette before he even makes it out the door. Too poor to afford a taxi, he will curse his way through every dark, misty mile between him and home, curse his luck, his long-dead father, and his son most of all. When the four men rise up out of the darkness around him, he will curse them, spit at them, lash drunkenly at them as cold, hard hands wrap around his arms, his legs, bring something cold to his face that will drive his shriveled consciousness into a deeper, inescapable night. When he awakes, he will tense against tight leather straps, arch against the sterile steel of a surgical table. "Is this about the money I owe?" he will ask the room. "'Cause I can pay." Like some fallen gutter king, he will offer a fortune in tainted trinkets, branded coasters, and plastic mugs bought with the faded currency cut from cigarette cartons, cracked heirlooms left by his own drunken father, and will even go so far as to offer his son as slave labor, or as the only kind of butchered flesh that can be slapped down upon sterile steel to satisfy a debt. No one answers, no one comes, and when the begging finally dissolves into sobbing, he will cry until he is hoarse, parched, turning his head away at the edge of a slow-coming, brutal sleep. He will whisper a silent repentance, drift away again into a darkness that will never part. It will take 3 days for Mr. Angeletti's son to file a missing persons report, go out looking for his wayward father. But even after a week of looking, asking, checking bars and the flats of friends, he will find nothing. Only the dark figure who will bury his father in a grave of lime and lye beneath the concrete pad of a patio that will be laid that first day will know what happened to him, will know how loud he screamed, how desperately he pleaded as he was carefully vivisected, injected with a cocktail of vicious pharmaceuticals, and forced to watch as his living organs were removed one by one, meticulously weighed and fed to a trio of slavering, sickly-looking, fighting dogs. Part 10. Mrs. Martinez is a Scorpio. On Fridays, she rides the 805 with a sack of laundry as rotund as she is, and gets off at the Panderia on 5th Street. After exchanging greetings and snatches of gossip with another woman who shares her native tongue, she purchases an empanada and 2 pan de huevos, frosted with pink shortening. The woman behind the counter bags the treats slowly, purposefully, and as the conversation rolls from family to daytime television, the line behind Mrs. Martinez grows long and anxious. When she pays, the bill is always the same. $1.15. Mrs. Martinez takes her time in paying, draws out the conversation with the Panderia's only cashier as long as possible, ignores the silently frustrated men and women who scratch their feet, frown at one another until the last adios is said, and the sluggish line begins to move again. One day, Mrs. Martinez stumps across the street to the laundromat, oblivious or uncaring even as traffic breaks for her, drivers throwing hands in frustration as they're forced to slow and stop. Brown hands will throw grimy clothes into mixed, unsorted piles, cram washers so full they creak and judder as they spin against the forced weight. The lone, orange-pink plastic chair at the far end of the laundromat will creak beneath Mrs. Martinez's spreading backside as she leans back, fat fingers flinging pink frosting, rubbing grease into the pages of someone else's abandoned magazine. A fluff piece about the weight-loss tactics of some momentarily popular soap star will distract her eyes, pull her in so completely, with shots of frowns and flab contrasting with smiles and anorexia, that she'll hardly notice as sunlight gives way wholly to fluorescence. Heavily papered shop windows, slowly secured with the lowering of sheets of articulated tin. Even the click of the door lock slamming home will be lost in the hammering thrum of overloaded washers, pass as unnoticed as the first wisps of stink drifting from vents, eking from unsealed cracks between drywall and floor. Eyes will drift, lids falling a little as heavy breaths fill lungs with cold air, greasy nostrils slowly losing smell, already growing used to the taint. Even after the washing machines clatter to a stop, Mrs. Martinez will wait in a sleepy stupor, uncertain, her mind thickening as steadily as the air does. All it will take is the innocent movement of snapping awake, of rubbing her nose and pushing the metal feet of the chair against the scratchy, textured tile of the floor to set events in motion. Half risen, her last thought will be one of unfocused frustration, of confusion, before the flames engulf her, scream through the gas-tainted air, char fat flesh from bones, and blast burnt caskets of steaming clothing through the security-sealed windows and out into the street. Part 11. Mr. Jefferson is a Sagittarius. On alternate Wednesdays, he catches the 8:05 to parent-teacher meetings at an inner-city charter school, tries not to act bored as the all-female staff, drenched in sports bras and thin gold crucifixes, twitter about church life, soccer meetups, and cheap pizza. Every meeting is mandatory. Every meeting leaves him with the profound thirst for a cold beer, sometimes two. Every meeting he finds himself drifting away, staring at a different pair of perky breasts beneath a pair of indignant eyes, just as the conversation drifts to him, demands his feedback on the antics of his antisocial child. One night, childless and alone, Mr. Jefferson will pass up a visit to the local pub and wander south, wander over older streets, near oppressive, faceless buildings, until the neon oasis of some dingy, all-night Pan-Asian restaurant draws him in out of the darkness, leads him to a tiny table topped with a loose sheet of plexiglass and a pair of greasy menus. The dried-up husk of a waiter will smile at him through a face ravaged by scars and missing teeth, bring him a strangely textured, green-brown glass full of water that is less clear and more swirling sediment. Uncertain, tired, Mr. Jefferson will order a beer, request a glass of ice when the bottle comes warm, and then finally settle on some mixture of rice noodles, beef, and soy that comes under the appetizing label of Chef Special, hot, also good. Hot it will be. Good, not so much. And after Mr. Jefferson chokes his way through the first few bites, he will set the dish aside, try to wash the taste out of his mouth with more beer. Grinning, the waiter will return, ask him in broken English if the meal is good, if he would like to order more, but the grin will fade a little when Mr. Jefferson laughs at him, makes a tired, frustrated comment comparing the chef special to liquid shit with hot sauce. Shaking his head in shame, the waiter will take the dish away as quickly as possible and disappear into the back of the restaurant. Within minutes, voices will rise, clattering nasal tones cutting air as arguing turns into yelling, yelling into shouting. Mr. Jefferson will slouch back in his chair, cross his arms, and smile a little at the commotion, quickly wipe the smile from his face when the waiter emerges again, announces in stammered syllables that the chef would like to meet his customer, receive honest feedback on a dish that is still very much a work in progress. Why not? Mr. Jefferson will scratch a little, give the edge of a smile. Could be fun. Tracing his way into the back through clusters of dusty boxes stamped with undecipherable characters, he will push aside the curtain of yellowed plastic beads that separates the filthy kitchen from the crowded dining room, stand uncertainly at the threshold until a high, violent voice screams something incomprehensible at him from just inside the doorway. The last thing he will see is steel, the glint of the rushing edge of a shining cleaver falling into his face, silencing his mind in a single stroke. Nothing will remain of the blood that gouts from his skull and splatters the floor as he falls when a tired officer trades a few words with the waiter a week later. The chef will grin and gesture from beyond the beaded curtain, ask the officer to stay for lunch, but he will quietly decline. Memories of tales of a few bad chef specials shared by others in the department will come back to him, bring him to wave politely in thanks, and wander northward to a corner curry house that has been on his mind for the past several weeks. 12. Mrs. Dawson is a Capricorn. Today, as she boards the 805, she sits beside me, my only companion as the bus discreetly passes the officers of the newspaper that prints the daily horoscopes that I spend my afternoons tapping out on the rusty iron keys of my aged typewriter. Middle-aged and single, childless, she hides her breasts under high-necked sweaters, wears her chestnut hair in a modest bun, and as I glance at her, the smile she gives me in return is entirely forced, her mind lost in a quiet miasma of darker thoughts. In her hands, she holds today's newspaper. My newspaper, her fingers flicking through business and comics to things regarded as less serious. The obituaries, the births, marriages, stopping on the horoscopes. My horoscopes, yesterday's predictions of today's reality. I smile silently back. I know that when the bus leaves her a block and a half from the accounting firm where she works, a man in leather and denim will grab her and stuff her into a sack. Crying, screaming, she will suffer through a dark, stifling ride in a faded, primer-colored panel van, claw at hands that bind her wrists, her ankles, with twisted lengths of itchy rope. Men will beat her with fists and clubs, and even before the first blow falls, she will give up hope, become entirely resigned to her fate. I know that Miss Dawson is claustrophobic, just as I know that at an unnamed pier at the edge of town, an empty crate waits for her. I know that she will give one last, burbling scream before a dozen hands shove her into that deeper darkness and drive home the lock, just as I know that 12 days from now a team in fluorescent vests will dredge her stricken corpse out of the sludge a dozen paces from the cafe where I take my tea on Sundays. I will smile just as silently. The tea will warm my soul. The oblivious waitress will bring me the remains of the day's paper. Casually, I will flip to the back, to the page where the horoscopes mingle with the obituaries. I will reflect on my handiwork, scribble a quick note, and before the 8:05 arrives, I will finish my tea and leave a $5 for the waitress. After all, there is still much work to do.